Hey, how's it going? Fine. Are you okay? Yeah, I'm fine. Alright, well, if there's anything I can do, you know. I spent a lot of my young life trying to figure out when it was okay for me to speak, which eventually turned into a fascination that I have with communication and language and words. But in my teenage years, I grew up mostly with my father, who's someone who didn't really speak very much. Or at least he didn't express any opinions or feelings or thoughts. It sounds weird, but the whole time I lived with him, I can't recall having a vulnerable conversation. Yeah. I never really knew what was going on in his head. I remember him expressing this idea of you can speak when you're spoken to, which I always thought was kind of weird because I was never really spoken to. It's confusing as a kid because I don't think I've ever had a situation where someone was like, all right, now you talk, or I don't I don't really get the scenario in which you are spoken to speak. If we did communicate, it was usually through a note that was left on the kitchen table or an email, which honestly I preferred because then it gave me a moment to collect my thoughts and try to make my point clearly and concisely. And if I did have to speak with him in person, I would, take a moment beforehand and try to do the same thing. I would try to figure out, okay, how do I say this in a way that's not gonna upset him, that's also gonna get my point across as quickly as possible before I'm cut off. It was really hard because if he did cut you off and then you tried to backtrack and re-explain yourself, then that was treated as talking back. So that's probably where this all started. What's funny is part of my fascination with words actually came from him. Because at random moments, he would just say a random word. We'd be in the car on a long drive, listening to the radio, not speaking. And suddenly he would just turn down the radio and say, ubiquitous, seemingly everywhere. And then you turn the radio back up and we just continue the drive. Which is super random, but also I was kind of I enjoyed learning a new word. And then for the first half of my childhood, I lived with my mom, who was someone who's often fumbling her words or making up words. And there was never a feeling like I wasn't allowed to express anything, really. But my mom grew up with a Japanese mother who spoke mostly broken English. So when she was growing up, she actually learned some things just wrong because she was repeating the broken English of her mother. So for example, if traffic was particularly congested, you might say that's bumper to bumper traffic. But my grandmother would say that's bumper to traffic. And so my mom thought it was that too. And it was a while until somebody, corrected her. But I think that's partly why she just kind of, speak English loosely, because a lot of her experience with her mother was more interpretive. You couldn't necessarily take everything she said literally. Eventually, my mom ended up marrying this Turkish man who also spoke broken English. And it was pretty funny to see my stepfather attempt to communicate with my grandmother because they both spoke broken English, but like their own flavor of it, like whatever the Japanese version of broken English versus whatever the Turkish version of broken English was, and together they had no clue what each other was saying. But they'd struggle through. And I was really close with my grandmother. She's somebody who I really look up to, and she's someone who, in observation, I can tell has a lot of deep wisdom within her. And she's happy to share it, it just comes out, in broken English a lot of the time. Which puts me in this position where I have to kind of see the layer beneath the language, understanding that she's using the words that she has available, but not necessarily the correct words, right? I also spent some time working jobs alongside a lot of people from Hispanic cultures who spoke their own form of broken English. And, that was interesting. I know a handful of Spanish words, and they knew a handful of English words, and together we would struggle along as well. And honestly, it's amazing the depth of conversation you can actually have with somebody with only like 100 or so words between you. All these experiences led me to view words and language and communication as something that needs to be interpreted, particularly if they're expressing themselves. Like if you're expressing a thought, that can be a challenge. You're taking something abstract and trying to map it onto language. So I'd often find myself trying to look beyond the words that people are using and recognize the intention and the meaning that lives beneath that. I get the sense that most of us aren't really walking around using the exact dictionary definition of words. I think for the most part, we have a general understanding, and then a majority of the words we use are words we've heard, and their meaning is presumed by the context in which we've heard them. And generally, I feel like a lot of people can be pretty, loose with their words, leaning on the assumption that they'll be understood, even if the word isn't exact. My favorite example of this is probably the word energy, which is a word I use a lot, and I hear used a lot, and often in very different contexts. Energy has like an actual scientific use. So it's funny to me that we use it to describe like a metaphysical force, but it's also used to describe the feeling that you get when someone walks into the room. What is that? I guess that would be like presence. But like that word doesn't necessarily feel quite right, and energy somehow just feels closer. It doesn't feel exact, but it does feel kind of like the best word for lots of different situations. I've never used that word and had the person that I was in conversation with, look at me sideways like, what are you talking about? And so then I get really confused when people are scrutinized for their language, particularly like in person. Like moments where intention is like completely ignored and people just kind of get hung up on a word and then maybe interrogated about what they meant. I guess it isn't always clear. communication gets muddied by the fact that our words don't always aim to represent our intentions. Sometimes people are passive aggressive or withholding, and sometimes people are just speaking in whatever way feels socially appropriate. I really don't like that as a culture. I feel like we've become so hung up on words. And I get the sense that part of that has to do with the fact that we communicate mostly through the internet, through text. And when you're texting, you have this assumption that a person has an opportunity to correct something before they send it. And so it might be a little bit justifiably easier to judge what a person says when it's written. But I feel like that same scrutiny somehow bled into, more social face-to-face situations. Someone just casually speaking is held to the same standard as a resume, which really doesn't feel fair, and it kind of frustrates me when you think about the amount of people who have social anxiety and difficulty expressing themselves. And when they find little moments of courage to attempt to, but then someone starts picking apart the words they used, it just seems cruel. And suddenly I feel like a kid all over again, thinking about what I'm going to say, how I'm going to say it, and how it's going to come across. Despite the fact that I'm speaking the same language as most of the people I talk to, it often feels like I'm not. Like maybe we're using the same words, but are we using them for the same purpose? Because some people communicate kind of performatively. Some people are opportunistic and they communicate in a more transactional way. Some people communicate on behalf of like an invisible audience or group that they're representing. Sometimes our emotions take the wheel and we communicate from a place of anger or fear or remorse, And with all that variation, I often feel like it's rare that I'm speaking to someone who shares my intention. I feel this pressure socially to speak quickly or to respond quickly. And often, especially if somebody asks me like a sincere question, I'd much rather just think about it for a moment because I want to give them a sincere response. So I've gotten better at actually requesting a moment to think about it before responding. Which is really cool because it seems really obvious to me now, but I never even thought that was an option. But so far, I've never asked somebody like, hey, can I get a minute? And had them react like, no. The worst is when I ask someone for a moment to think, and I sit there for like 30 seconds, observing the blank void of my mind before just giving up. So then I just create an awkward silence to achieve nothing. It happens. But we have a difficult time with silence. It's hard to say exactly why. It's easy to think that we're all just kind of talking to each other, but for the most part, I think we're all surviving through a kind of cooperative interpretation with one another. And so when someone's not cooperating, it just seems mean to me. Like some people are listening for mistakes, and other people are listening for meaning. But despite all the social anxiety and awkwardness, and the multiple ways in which it's easy for us to misinterpret one another, somehow we keep managing to create moments of genuine understanding, which is pretty amazing. Honestly, it barely makes sense to me, but it's pretty cool.